May 3, 1945. The war in Europe will end in 4 days. RAF typhoons sweep low over Lübeck Bay, unleashing rockets into the largest ship at anchor, the SS Cap Arcona. Within minutes, the former luxury liner, once called the Queen of the South Atlantic, is a wall of flame. The pilots believe they are hitting a Nazi troop transport. They are wrong. Locked below her decks are over 4,000 concentration camp prisoners, many too weak to move. By nightfall, fewer than 350 will survive. How did the RAF not know? Who ordered those prisoners onto that ship? And why, with victory days away, did thousands die in a single afternoon? The answers begin not in Lübeck Bay, but decades earlier, in the shipyards of Hamburg. In the summer of 1927, the Blohm and Voss shipyard in Hamburg unveiled its newest creation, a vessel so grand that newspapers called it the Queen of the South Atlantic. The SS Cap Arcona stretched 676 feet from bow to stern, her hull gleaming above the Elbe River. At 27,560 tons, she was one of the largest liners Germany had ever produced, designed to rival the British and French giants of the age. The blueprints, preserved in the shipyard's archives, reveal a ship built for both power and pleasure. Twin steam turbines turning out 28,000 horsepower, propelling her across the Atlantic at a steady 20 knots. Inside, the Cap Arcona was a floating palace. Passengers boarding in Hamburg entered a world of polished wood and brass, marble staircases, and wide corridors that echoed with the sounds of a string quartet. Her first-class cabins offered private bathrooms and telephones, rare luxuries in the 1920s. The grand dining saloon could seat hundreds beneath crystal chandeliers, while the smoking lounge and winter garden promised respite from the North Atlantic's chill. Brochures from the Hamburg Suedamerikanische Dampfschifffahrtsgesellschaft, her proud owner, boasted of electric lighting in every stateroom and a kitchen capable of serving 1,500 meals a day. The Cap Arcona's regular route linked Hamburg with Rio de Janeiro, Montevideo, and Buenos Aires, with stops in Lisbon and Vigo for coal and mail. Each voyage carried a mix of emigrants, businessmen, and tourists, drawn by the promise of comfort and adventure. Timetables from the 1930s show a bi-weekly schedule, the liner's name printed in bold beside her sister ships. Memoirs from passengers recall the sense of occasion that came with boarding her decks, white-gloved stewards, the gentle roll of the ship, the anticipation of landfall in a distant hemisphere. For more than a decade, the Cap Arcona embodied the optimism of interwar travel. Her ballrooms hosted masquerade balls and afternoon teas, her promenades filled with laughter and the clink of glasses. Even the third-class quarters, though less ornate, offered space and amenities that surpassed many rivals. The ship's reputation for safety and elegance made her a favorite among South American elites as well as German families seeking new lives abroad. Photographs from the period show smiling passengers on deck, framed by the ship's graceful lines and the open sea. This was the Cap Arcona's world, a vessel built for movement, celebration, and the promise of arrival. Her vast spaces, designed to cradle thousands in luxury, would soon be pressed into service for purposes her builders never imagined. The same decks that once echoed with music and laughter would become silent, locked, and overcrowded, transformed by war and ideology into something unrecognizable. But in 1927, as she slipped out of Hamburg on her maiden voyage, none of that darkness had yet touched her hull. The outbreak of war brought an abrupt end to the Cap Arcona's days of elegance. In late November 1940, as the German Navy scoured the country for ships to meet its growing demands, a formal requisition order arrived at the Hamburg Sud offices. The Cap Arcona was seized and transferred to the Kriegsmarine. Her name was entered into Navy rolls as property of the state. No fanfare marked her departure from civilian life. Just a terse line in a government ledger and a new flag hoisted above the bridge. Within months, naval engineers and laborers moved through the ship, stripped away the trappings of luxury that had defined her. The marble balustrades and crystal chandeliers vanished, replaced by steel plating and reinforced decks. Passenger cabins were gutted to make space for barracks, and the grand dining saloon was converted into a mess hall for hundreds of men. Temporary medical bays and guard posts sprouted in former lounges. Where music and laughter once drifted down the corridors, the clang of hammers and the bark of orders took over. By early 1943, the transformation was complete. Official records from the Blohm and Voss shipyard detail the installation of steel-grated hatchways and the removal of all non-essential furnishings. The ship could now accommodate up to 800 naval personnel, her decks patrolled by armed guards. Her role shifted between troop transport, floating barracks, and auxiliary support for U-boat crews stationed along the Baltic coast. The once glamorous liner became a tool of war, serving the needs of an institution that valued utility over comfort or beauty. The Cap Arcona's commercial identity faded into memory as she was subsumed by the machinery of the Nazi state. The Hamburg Süd logo was painted over, her call sign changed, and her movements dictated by orders from Berlin. She became a number in a system that saw ships not as symbols of connection, but as assets to be deployed and, if necessary, sacrificed. Naval correspondence from this period reveals little sentiment for what was lost. The ship's fate was decided by the logic of total war, a logic that would soon demand even more from her. As the conflict dragged on and the regime's priorities darkened, the Cap Arcona's vast, emptied spaces offered a solution to a new kind of problem. The same holds that had carried travelers across the Atlantic were now prepared for cargo of a different kind, setting the stage for the ship's final and most tragic role. Neuengama's iron gates first swung open in 1938, ushering in an era of forced labor and silent terror on the outskirts of Hamburg. Over the next 7 years, more than 100,000 men and women would pass through its barracks. Soviet prisoners of war, Jews, political dissidents, and resistance fighters from across occupied Europe. By April 1945, as the Allies closed in from the west and north, the camp's command structure braced for collapse. The man at the center was SS Obersturmbannführer Max Pauli, a career officer with a reputation for unyielding discipline and loyalty to the regime's darkest ambitions. On April 12, 1945, an order arrived from Berlin. The language was clinical, but the message was absolute. No prisoner shall be allowed to fall into Allied hands. Any attempt to surrender shall be met with immediate execution. Pauli, entrusted with carrying out this directive, signed Neuengama's own evacuation order, Evakuierungsbefehl No. 34, on April 18, 1945. The document survives in the camp's archives, its lines spelling out a plan for total erasure. All inmates were to be moved north, under armed guard, to the port of Lübeck. Guards were instructed to lock hatches, ration food and water to the bare minimum, and use lethal force against any sign of resistance. The evacuation wasn't a rescue. It was a final act of control. Pauli's policy made clear that the regime's primary concern was not the welfare of prisoners, but the elimination of witnesses. The camp's administrative files show the prisoner population in early April, roughly 10,000, with Jews, Soviet prisoners of war, and political prisoners making up the largest groups. Mortality rates had already soared to nearly 30%, driven by starvation, disease, and the relentless pace of forced labor. Now, with liberation only days away, the threat shifted from neglect to outright annihilation. Survivor accounts collected after the war describe the mood as word of the order spread. Some prisoners clung to rumors of imminent freedom. Others recognized the pattern from earlier evacuations. Samuel Weiss, a 21-year-old Polish Jew, later recalled the sense of dread. "We knew the end was near, not the war's end, but ours. The guards grew harsher, the food stopped coming, and we heard talk of the ships." Pauly's signature on the evacuation order set in motion the camp's final chapter. Prisoners were assembled in the main yard, counted and recounted, then divided into columns for the march north. Armed SS men, some fresh from the Eastern Front, flanked the lines. The instructions were unambiguous. No one was to escape, and no one was to be left behind alive. The ideology that had built Nguyen Game was now determined to erase it, body by body, file by file. With the camp under siege from within and without, the evacuation began. The human stakes, already measured in months of hunger and brutality, now escalated with every step toward Lübeck. The question that haunted survivors and liberators alike was simple and chilling. Why, with defeat, certain, and liberation so close, did the regime choose murder over surrender? The answer lay not in military logic, but in an ideological resolve to leave no witnesses, and to bury the evidence of atrocity at the bottom of the Baltic Sea. Columns of prisoners left Nguyen Game under the watch of SS guards, their ranks thinned by weeks of starvation and disease. The order was clear: march north, leave nothing behind. The road to Lübeck stretched nearly 70 kilometers, but the journey was measured less by distance than by the bodies that fell along the way. Survivor accounts recall the first steps taken in the camp yard, the guards shouting "Weiter," while rifle butts prodded the stumbling and the sick. Samuel Weiss, only 21, later described the sound of boots on muddy ground, the silence broken by gunshots when someone collapsed. The guards showed no hesitation. Those who could not keep pace were left where they fell, or shot as a warning to the rest. The forced march did not follow a single road, but wound through villages and fields, avoiding Allied patrols. Prisoners passed through the outskirts of Hamburg, then north into the open countryside. Some groups marched by day, exposed to the spring sun and the threat of strafing aircraft. Others were pushed through the night, rain soaking their rags, the cold settling into their bones. In the second wave, men and women stumbled through darkness, unable to see their own feet, guided only by the shouts and blows of their captors. Water was scarce. Food, almost non-existent. Prisoners scavenged for roots and grass, sometimes trading scraps of cloth with local children for a crust of bread. The guards rationed what little they carried, reserving most for themselves. The SS records from this period list the evacuation as a routine transfer, but survivor testimonies tell of men drinking from ditches, of women fainting from hunger, of children forced to carry the dead on makeshift stretchers. The convoy's pace was relentless. Each day, the distance between Nguyen Game and Lübeck seemed to grow, not shrink. By the time the first groups reached Bad Oldesloe, the roll call was already short by hundreds. Some prisoners escaped into the woods, but most were too weak to try. Those who did were hunted down by local police or shot by the roadside. The official logs omit these deaths, but the memories of those who survived do not. As the march neared Lübeck, the prisoners' world narrowed to the rhythm of footsteps and the fear of collapse. Allied artillery rumbled in the distance, a promise of liberation that never seemed to arrive. For many, the port was not a destination, but the end of hope. The survivors who reached Lübeck did so with swollen feet, blistered skin, and the knowledge that their numbers had dwindled with every kilometer. By late April, the battered columns arrived at the docks. The port was crowded with ships, rusting hulls, cargo freighters, the once magnificent Cap Arcona looming among them. Prisoners were herded into holding pens, counted and recounted, then left to wait as SS officers conferred with ship captains and guards. The suffering of the march had not ended. It had only delivered them to a new kind of uncertainty. The next stage would not be a journey to freedom. but a passage into the unknown, sealed behind steel hatches and guarded by men who had already shown what mercy meant in these final days of war. At Lübeck's docks, ships once built for leisure and commerce now waited under SS command. The Cap Arcona, designed for 1,300 passengers, stood beside the Lübeck and the Athens. Their new cargo would not be disembarking. Surviving manifests and post-war records show the Cap Arcona took on about 6,000 prisoners. The Lübeck held another 2,000. The Athens, a smaller freighter, carried around 300. In all, more than 8,000 men and women, Jews, Soviet prisoners of war, political prisoners, and resistance fighters were forced aboard at gunpoint. The SS divided the prisoners by nationality and status and methodically filled the ships. The Cap Arcona's holds filled first, crammed with Jews and Soviet prisoners, packed shoulder to shoulder. The Lübeck's manifest listed over 1,500 Jews and several hundred others. The Athens received the weakest and sickest. Survivors remembered being counted, recounted, and assigned to ships with no explanation. Samuel Weiss recalled that they shuffled forward, one by one, past the SS men with their clipboards. There was nowhere to sit, nowhere to rest. The air was already thick with the smell of fear and sweat. Official records from Lübeck confirm the scale. The Cap Arcona's name appears next to 4,800 Jews, 800 Soviet prisoners of war, and another 600 political prisoners and others, squeezed into every available corner. The Lübeck's list shows 1,500 Jews, 300 Soviet prisoners of war, and 200 more. The Athens, with its smaller capacity, was filled last, its hatches sealed, as soon as the final group stumbled aboard. No effort was made to distribute people evenly or humanely. The only goal was to fill every space, locking the hatches once quotas were met. Guards patrolled the decks, shouting at anyone who lingered or begged for water. In some compartments, men could not sit or lie down. The Cap Arcona, once a floating palace, now held thousands pressed together in darkness, denied even the most basic necessities. The transformation was complete. Port records, SS manifests, and survivor accounts all point to the same arithmetic. More than 7,000 souls packed into 3 ships with no food, no water, and no hope. The scale of the loading turned the Cap Arcona and her sister ships into the largest concentration camp in the Baltic, anchored, silent, and sealed from the world. May 3rd, 1945. Lübeck Bay lay calm, but inside the Cap Arcona, Lübeck, and Athens, darkness pressed in on thousands of prisoners. The hatches were welded shut from the outside. No food, no clean water, no medical help. Survivors later described the holds as suffocating, the air thick with sweat and panic. There was barely room to sit, and the only light crept in through cracks under the doors before vanishing into gloom. Affidavits collected after the war revealed the guards' cruelty. SS men stalked the decks with rifles and pistols, barking orders, striking anyone who moved too slowly. When desperate prisoners begged for water or tried to reach the railings, they were met with blows or gunfire. One Polish survivor remembered, "We hammered on the hatch, shouting for help. The guards shouted back that anyone who tried to escape would be shot. One man tried to climb up for air. They shot him in front of us." On the Cap Arcona, the ship's grand halls, once filled with music, echoed with groans and prayers. In the lower holds, heat and stench grew unbearable. Guards had strict orders: keep the prisoners locked in, no matter what. Official records confirm the SS brought no provisions for the journey. A token supply of water was barely enough for a handful. The rest licked condensation from steel walls or passed a single bucket from hand to hand. The violence was deliberate. Guards fired at any sign of resistance. Their orders were clear: no one was to escape. No one was to survive to tell what had happened at Neuengamme. Survivor testimony paints a picture of hope draining away as the ships remained anchored. The only sounds, the boots of guards overhead and the occasional scream when patience snapped. Aboard the Thielbeck and Athen, conditions were the same. Prisoners packed into airless cargo spaces, hatches locked tight. Some clawed at seams with bare hands. Others slumped to the floor, too weak to stand. SS men watched from above, pistols drawn. One inmate saw a guard pour water overboard, laughing as men below pleaded for a drink. These ships were not meant to carry survivors. The welded hatches, the absence of food and water, the violence. Every detail pointed to a single purpose. By midday, silence settled over the holds. The Cap Arcona, once a symbol of hope, waited as a silent witness to a crime still unfolding. On the evening of May 2, 1945, British command issued clear orders to the 2nd Tactical Air Force, led by Air Vice Marshal John Cunningham, to prevent any German ships in Lübeck Bay from being used for military evacuation. The war's end was near, but the directive was blunt. Every vessel, unless unmistakably neutral, was a target. Intelligence came from intercepted German radio messages and reconnaissance photos, painting a picture of large ships anchored off Neustadt. These were believed to be troop transports or supply vessels, possibly preparing to evacuate SS units or senior Nazi officials to Norway. There was no mention of prisoners, civilians, or Red Cross involvement in the operational summaries sent to the squadrons. RAF planners spent the night poring over maps and grainy images, identifying the Cap Arcona, Thielbeck, and Athen as anonymous silhouettes among the shipping. The mission order, RAF HQTAF 051, listed targets by their location and size, not by name. Attack instructions called for low-level rocket and cannon runs, with high-altitude bombing as backup if the weather worsened. Pilots were told to look for neutral markings, but none were expected. The only specific restriction was, do not attack ships flying Swedish or Swiss flags. None of the vessels in the bay matched that description. Squadron leader James Brown later described the atmosphere as focused and routine. We were told enemy shipping might be evacuating troops. Our job was to make sure no one escaped. There was no mention of prisoners or anything out of the ordinary. For weeks, the 2nd Tactical Air Force had been hitting Baltic ports, targeting anything that could aid the Nazi retreat. Intelligence was patchy, fragmented intercepts, blurred photos, and assumptions that quickly became certainties. The ships in Lübeck Bay were seen as enemy assets to be destroyed before they slipped away. Meanwhile, a telegram from the Swedish Red Cross was only just reaching the British Foreign Office. For the planners, nothing suggested the targets were anything but German military transports. The tragedy that followed was set in motion by the speed and uncertainty of war. At 12:45 p.m. on May 2, 1945, a telegram from the Swedish Red Cross was logged by the British Foreign Office. Its message was direct. 3 ships anchored in Lübeck Bay, Cap Arcona, Thielbeck, and Athen were packed with concentration camp prisoners. The cable, routed through the British Embassy in Stockholm, was forwarded to the Air Ministry with an urgent note. Yet as it entered the machinery of wartime bureaucracy, its warning faded. The Air Ministry's intelligence desk filed it as routine correspondence from a neutral country. No operational alert was attached. By the time planners at 2nd Tactical Air Force Headquarters met for their afternoon briefing, the telegram was just one among many signals stripped of urgency. RAF officers pored over reconnaissance photos and maps, searching for signs of German troop movements. The mission order, RAF HQTAF 051, was already prepared. The ships in Lübeck Bay appeared only as silhouettes and coordinates. Large hulls, presumed enemy transports, no neutral flags visible. Instructions were blunt: attack all vessels in the target area unless flying Swedish or Swiss colors. Humanitarian concerns were reduced to a single line: Do not engage vessels flagged neutral. The Cap Arcona, Lübeck, and Athens carried no such protection. During the final briefing, squadron leaders received their attack profile, low-level rocket and cannon runs, fallback to high-altitude bombing if weather demanded. Pilots were warned of possible anti-aircraft fire and told to watch for signs of evacuation. No mention was made of prisoners, civilians, or Red Cross warnings. Squadron leader James Brown later recalled, "We were told these were enemy ships, possibly evacuating SS or troops. There was nothing about prisoners or anything out of the ordinary. Nothing of the Red Cross warning was passed on. The Swedish telegram remained ignored." Number 140 Squadron's operational log made no note of the Red Cross warning. The sortie order was issued at 11:55 p.m. Aircraft were armed and crews briefed for dawn. The Air Ministry's daily log contained no reference to humanitarian intelligence. The last chance to halt the attack vanished in the shuffle. Engines started at sunrise, sealing the fate of thousands, not by intent, but by administrative failure. At 2:02 p.m. on May 3, 1945, the first formation of Royal Air Force Typhoon and Lancaster bombers roared low over Lübeck Bay. The pilots had been briefed that morning. Enemy shipping was gathering off Neustadt, likely preparing for a last-ditch escape to Norway. There was no mention of prisoners, no warning of what waited below. Squadron leader James Brown, flying lead in number 184 Squadron, later recalled that they saw a large ship at anchor with a white hull and no Red Cross. The orders were clear. Destroy all enemy vessels. The Cap Arcona's decks, once polished for first-class travelers, now bristled with SS guards and locked hatches. At 2:12 p.m., the first wave of bombers released their payload. 4 bombs, each weighing 500 pounds, struck the midship superstructure, tearing through steel and timber. A fireball erupted, followed by a column of black smoke visible for miles. The explosion ignited the ship's oil tanks, sending flames racing down passageways and into the crowded holds. Prisoners trapped below felt the shock wave before they heard the sirens. In the suffocating darkness, men and women hammered on the hatches, screaming for air as the heat intensified. Survivor Samuel Weiss described the first moments. It was as if the world split open. The floor shook, and the air turned to fire. They clawed at the walls, but there was nowhere to go. Above, Royal Air Force pilots circled for another pass. The Cap Arcona's upper decks were already ablaze. Flames leapt from the bridge to the lifeboat stations, melting davits and charring the last traces of luxury. A second wave of rockets and cannon fire raked the ship, shattering windows and sending debris into the water. The attack lasted minutes, but the destruction spread with terrifying speed. From the cockpit, Flight Lieutenant Brown watched as the inferno consumed the vessel. He said they saw smoke and men running on deck, but from that height you could not see faces or uniforms. They thought they were crew or troops. No one told them there were prisoners. Within 20 minutes, the Cap Arcona was engulfed from bow to stern. Survivors who managed to reach the open decks faced a wall of fire and the threat of gunfire from guards still enforcing orders. The water below, icy and littered with burning wreckage, offered the only escape. The ship, once a symbol of safe passage, had become a trap from which almost no one would emerge alive. Fire swept through the Cap Arcona's decks, turning the ship into a furnace. Prisoners trapped below pounded on steel hatches, their cries muffled by the roar of the flames and the thunder of exploding ammunition. Survivors later described the air filling with choking smoke, the heat so intense it peeled paint from the walls and warped the metal. Above, SS guards fired at anyone who broke free, determined to keep their orders, even as the ship burned around them. Some prisoners managed to reach the upper decks, only to find the lifeboats destroyed or out of reach. Samuel Weiss, a Polish Jew who survived both Neuengamme and the Cap Arcona, recalled, "We tore at the hatches with our bare hands. When the doors finally gave, the heat knocked us back. Men were burning alive. Some jumped overboard. Some were shot as they ran. The Lübeck, anchored nearby, was hit almost at the same moment. Bombs tore open her hull, and she began to list within minutes. Water rushed in, mixing with oil and debris, and the ship rolled onto her side, trapping most of her 2,000 prisoners below deck. Only a handful would escape. The Athon, smaller and further off, suffered less damage, but its human cargo was left stranded, watching the disaster unfold. On the Cap Arcona, chaos gave way to desperation. Prisoners leapt into the Baltic, the water barely above freezing. Many could not swim. Others were too weak from starvation and disease. Those who surfaced found themselves surrounded by burning wreckage and bodies. Some tried to cling to floating planks, but SS guards on the ship and onshore patrol boats fired into the water, killing many as they struggled to escape. The ship's final moments came quickly. Within half an hour, the Cap Arcona rolled to starboard, her stern engulfed in flames. Survivors described the decks tilting beneath their feet, the sound of collapsing bulkheads, and the sudden rush as the sea poured in. The once proud liner, built for celebration and safe passage, became a mass grave. Of the roughly 6,000 prisoners aboard, fewer than 350 survived. Most who made it to shore were rescued by local fishermen or German sailors, not by the authorities who had sealed them in. The rest, thousands, were lost, their bodies washing up along the beaches of Lübeck Bay for days after. One survivor's words echo through the decades: "We were so close to freedom, but the sea became our grave." Even now, the names of over 2,800 victims remain unrecorded, lost to bureaucracy, erased by war's chaos. Their families never received answers. Today, as archives slowly open and new testimonies surface, the obligation endures to confront uncomfortable truths, to remember the silence, and to ask who else history risks forgetting. Memory is not justice, but it is where justice begins. Share your thoughts below.